The echo in the rain. The rain was a relentless curtain, blurring the neon of the city into a smear of color. Detective Ben Carter, his trench coat damp and clinging, hunched deeper into the collar. The night was a symphony of urban groans, the screech of brakes, the distant wail of a siren, and the incessant drumming of rain on the asphalt. He patrolled his usual beat, the familiar landscape of alleys and shadowy corners a mirror to the turmoil within him. He hadn't #039 slept properly in weeks. The image was seared into his mind, every detail sharp and painful. A golden retriever, with fur the color of a summer sun, bounding through a field of daisies. He could almost feel the scratch of its rough tongue on his hand, the weight of its head on his lap. Buster. It had been 2 years since Buster had vanished, slipping out of the yard during a summer storm, and the loss still felt like a raw wound. He pushed the feeling down, shoving it into the compartment of his mind he usually reserved for grief. He had a job to do. He focused on the present, the damp air, the slick street. He was rounding the corner of a derelict warehouse when he heard it, a whimper, faint but distinct, cutting through the city and #039's cacophony. It was a small, desperate sound, and something in it tugged at his heart. He followed the sound, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Tucked beneath a rusted dumpster, huddled against the cold concrete, was a dog. Golden fur, wet and matted, clung to its thin frame. Its eyes, large and brown, were wide with fear. And in the split second Ben saw its face, his breath caught in his throat. It was him. Buster reincarnated. The dog was smaller, thinner, but the facial features, the tilt of the head, even the nervous flick of its ears, it was identical. A wave of emotion washed over Ben, a mixture of joy, disbelief, and a deep, primal need to protect this creature. "Hey, there," he said, his voice softer than he usually allowed himself. He crouched down slowly, extending a hand. The dog flinched, but didn't and #039 run. It and #039's okay, Ben murmured, and #039, am not going to hurt you, he noticed a thin collar around its neck, almost hidden beneath the matted fur. He reached out gingerly, and the dog, after a moment of hesitation, allowed his touch. The fur was coarse, damp, and cold. Carefully, Ben coaxed the dog out from under the dumpster. He wrapped his coat around the trembling creature, lifting it into his arms. The dog was surprisingly light. Ben felt a pang of anger. How could anyone leave such a beautiful animal to suffer like this? He walked quickly back to his patrol car, never taking his eyes off the dog huddled in his arms. It nuzzled against him, a small, fragile weight. He felt a familiar warmth spread through his chest, a warmth that had been missing for 2 long years. He placed the dog carefully on the passenger seat, its big brown eyes watching him intently. He reached across to turn on the heat, setting the defrosters to full blast. He glanced at the dog again, and this time he noticed something he had missed in the dim light of the alley. A tag, buried beneath the matted fur on its collar. With trembling hands, Ben pulled out the tag. He had to squint to make out the small, worn writing. His heart slammed against his ribs. The writing was an and #039 name. It was an address. An address he knew all too well. It was the address of his old partner, Detective Sarah Jenkins. His mind reeled. Sarah had moved away after Buster's disappearance, the guilt of that day weighing heavy on her. She was living in a small town now, a few hours away. Why would her address be on this dog? Why did it look so much like Buster? The rain seemed to intensify, mirroring the storm brewing within him. This wasn't and #039 a simple act of kindness. This was something much more complicated, something that threatened to shatter the fragile peace he had managed to build in the ruins of his grief. The unraveling thread. Ben drove to the station in a daze. The dog, now warm and starting to relax, sat quietly beside him. He registered the curious glances from his fellow officers as he walked in, carrying the golden retriever. End quote. What and hashtag 039, this, Carter, end quote, Sergeant Miller, his gruff supervisor, asked, eyebrows raised. End quote, found him under a dumpster, end quote, Ben explained, his voice tight. He avoided eye contact, focusing instead on the dog, who was now lapping water from a bowl he'd provided. He was, not in good condition. End quote, looks like a stray, end quote, Miller grumbled, end quote, we and hashtag 039, LL hand him over to the animal shelter tomorrow, end quote. End quote, no, end quote, Ben said, more forcefully than he intended, end quote, and hashtag 039, LL take care of him, end quote. Miller studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. He then shrugged, fine, just don't let it interfere with your work, Carter. We got a new lead in the Henderson robbery. Ben nodded, already tuning out the sergeant and hashtag 039's words. His entire focus was on the dog. He found a corner of the break room and settled onto a chair with the dog nestled at his feet. He gently stroked its fur, noticing again the uncanny resemblance to Buster. This was more than just a coincidence. He called Sarah's number. He hadn't spoken to her in a year, their last conversation wrought with awkward silences and unspoken accusations. He almost hung up when she answered, her voice laced with a weariness he remembered all too well. End quote, Ben, end quote, she said, surprised, end quote, what and hashtag 039's wrong, end quote. End quote, Sarah, it and hashtag 039's about the dog, end quote, Ben started, his voice low, end quote, the one with your address on his tag, end quote. There was a long pause on the other end. End quote, what are you talking about, Ben? I Don and hashtag 039, have a dog, end quote. End quote, the one I found, end quote, he corrected, end quote, he looks like Buster. Exactly like him. And he has a tag with your new address on it, end quote. He could hear Sarah sharply drawing breath, a shocked inhale. Ben, I don't understand. That's impossible. I know, but it's true. Look, can you tell me anything about this? Did you get a dog after you moved?